Welcome to the New America Foundation. My name is Peter Bergen. I run the National Security Program here. It's with great pleasure that I get to welcome Colonel Pete Mansoor, the author of a stunning new book, The Surge, which is going to be one of the key books about the Iraq War. Deep research, and of course, Colonel Mansoor was there for so much of the key events that he describes in the book. So it's both a real history, but also with an element of memoir. Colonel Mansoor is also a professor at Ohio State. He was executive officer to General Petraeus. He has a PhD. He holds the Raymond Mason Chair in Military History at Ohio State. So we're really pleased to have you here, sir. And after Colonel Mansoor gives his presentation, we're going to have Lieutenant Colonel Joel Rayburn, who's long been a friend of the New America Foundation, who will sort of produce some responses to what Colonel Mansoor says. Lieutenant Colonel Rayburn is leading an operational study of the Iraq War for the U.S. Army. He is also studying for his PhD at Texas A&M University. His PhD concerns the British experience in Iraq, which I think is probably worse than the American experience in Iraq, I hope. And we're really pleased to have both of you here, so welcome to both of you. Colonel Mansoor is going to give his presentation from the podium now. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you, Peter, for that kind introduction, and thank you all for coming today. I really appreciate the New America Foundation sponsoring this talk. I was not going to write this book. I retired from the military in 2008, and although I knew that there was a story to be told there, I was going to let it take some time to digest and develop. And I was thinking maybe 10, 20 years down the road I would write a history of the Iraq War. But a couple years later, in the summer of 2010, I was at a conference with a veritable who's who of counterinsurgency experts in the United States. And we were talking about what to do in Iraq. Of course, the Iraq War, in Afghanistan. And of course, what to do in Afghanistan in 2010 was an issue of major concern in the United States. And invariably, the discussion devolved into what had happened in Iraq, especially what had happened during the surge and why ethno-sectarian violence was reduced so much in that period. And in listening to what the various experts had to say, it was clear to me that not one of them had a holistic understanding of the Iraq War, and especially the surge. And right then and there, I decided to put aside the research I was conducting on the liberation of the Philippines in 1944-45, which will be the subject of my next book. Much nicer writing about people who are thoroughly dead and therefore can't disagree with what you have to say about them. And I decided to write this book. So this is 3 years in the making now, and I understood where the sources were for it since we had developed and collected an archive of documents for General Petraeus while the surge was ongoing, with an eye towards history eventually. Those documents went to Central Command and then to the National Defense University, and I'm indebted to the folks there in both those places for declassifying so many of the documents that I used to write this history. It would not have been possible without their assistance. So what went wrong in Iraq? The subject of the first very long chapter in the book. The Bush administration made some assumptions going into the Iraq War, that it would be a war of liberation, that the Iraqi people by and large would support the taking down Saddam Hussein, a very brutal and hated dictator. And that since they would cooperate with the American forces, the government and the infrastructure would largely remain intact. And therefore, the United States didn't need to plan for a long occupation or an extended rehabilitation of the country. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld also looked on Iraq as a laboratory to test his theories and to validate, really, the revolution in military affairs, the idea that high-tech forces with precision-guided munitions and robust intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets could collapse an enemy state relatively quickly at the center of beginning at the center of gravity, and then wind up the war fairly rapidly and with fewer casualties, and that This was the sort of wave of the future, the revolution in military affairs that the U.S. military was going to take advantage of. Unfortunately, the enemy didn't cooperate. Lieutenant General Scott Wallace, commander of V Corps, as he's marching up country towards Baghdad, his supply lines are being attacked by guerrillas, by the Saddam Fedayeen. And he makes a comment to the press that this is not the enemy we wargamed against. And for his candidness, he was nearly relieved of command. And this is sort of part and parcel with how the Secretary of Defense and the administration dealt with things that went against their preconceived notions. They simply stuck their head in the sand and said, it's not happening. So when there was evidence that an insurgency was developing, well, it wasn't an insurgency, it was merely dead-enders, the last remnants of the Saddam Hussein administration. And once we got rid of them, then everything would be okay. As late as November 2003, President Bush, in a meeting of the National Security Council, said, don't tell me that there's a insurgency in Iraq. I'm not there yet. And this in the midst of the first insurgent Ramadan offensive, which my brigade and others in Iraq were busy combating. In addition to these assumptions that were made, which proved incorrect, there were two really key decisions made in the first 10 days of Ambassador L. Paul Bremer III's tenure as head of the Coalition Provisional Authority. He gets to Baghdad in May of 2003, and the first decision he makes is to de-Ba'athify Iraqi society. Now, some de-Ba'athification was going to have to take place. If you had lopped off several hundred or maybe up to 1,000 of the top Ba'athists, it probably would have been okay. But instead, Bremer decided to de-Ba'athify all the way down to the Furqa level, or the division level of the Ba'ath Party, and thereby got rid of not just the top leaders of the Iraqi government, Saddam Hussein, his family, and their immediate advisors, but tens of thousands of Iraqis who had joined the Ba'ath Party because it was the only way to get a decent job. So who were these people? They were doctors, lawyers, engineers, university professors, civil servants, all the same people that our own war plans assumed would remain in place to make sure that Iraq continued to function in the post-war period. And with one stroke of the pen, he got rid of them. Not only that, but since many of these people were Sunni, and they were now denied their jobs, pensions, participation in the political life of the country, what they viewed as the de-Sunnification of, they started to, instead of agreeing that Saddam Hussein was bad and it was good to get rid of him and they would help us with the new Iraq, which I think initially I got that sense being on the ground that some people were willing to give us the benefit of doubt. Instead, we alienated them. And with one stroke of the pen, L. Paul Bremer III created the political basis for the insurgency. The second decision was to disband the Iraqi army, a national institution that had fought for 8 years against Iran, many Shia in the Iraqi army, and it wasn't an instrument of regime control the way that the Republican Guard, the Special Republican Guard, the Fedayeen Saddam were. And we had to eliminate those instruments of regime control, but not the Iraqi army. The Iraqi army was an institution that could have been rehabilitated under new leadership and used to help stabilize post-war Iraq. And instead, Bremer disbanded it. Now, in his memoirs, he says, I was just acknowledging the obvious because the soldiers had taken off their uniforms and had gone home. But it's a pretty disingenuous statement, because they had also, what he doesn't say is they had taken their weapons home with them. And that had we wanted to bring them back and call them back to the colors, we could have. Why do I know this? Because when it was pointed out to Bremer that we had now had several 100,000 armed young men without jobs on the street, he decided that we would offer them back pay and that they could come and collect their back pay and a stipend, and that would give them something with which to start their new lives. They all showed up. It would have been very easy to have a recruiting table right there saying you want to continue your job, help guard your country, prevent the looting, and so forth. And we wouldn't have gotten them all of them, but we would have gotten a significant portion, and we wouldn't have had to start to recreate the Iraqi security forces out of whole cloth. What this did is not only put hundreds of thousands of armed young men on the streets, but tens of thousands of